Good afternoon. I would say we slowly start, even though people are just coming in, but as we have an additional panel afterwards and then another session, I think we should still not lose too much time. While we acknowledge, I think that the first panel after the very brief lunch break is, of course, a difficult one, but we are very grateful to have people joining in the room and online and also on the live stream. So welcome. This panel is focusing on content governance in times of crisis. So I hope that all of you here present in the room had already a very insightful and thought-provoking morning. There were many sessions in parallel with really fascinating discussions, many of which will also feed into the panel we are having right now. And I hope that you also all made kind of good use of the expertise that we had in the different rooms. And I'm very happy to have the stellar panel here today. My name is Julia Haas. I am the SAIFE project officer at the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media. And the people of you who joined the different sessions this morning are already familiar with some of the people sharing this panel with me. I will briefly introduce them when giving them the floor, but you all have the list of biographies. So for the sake of time, I will not introduce them at length. Just very briefly, as you all might know, that in the beginning of this year, the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media published the SAIFE Policy Manual, which provides policy guidance for states on how to safeguard free speech and media pluralism in the use of AI for content governance. And this is the outcome of a more than 2-year-long process where we worked with many of you here in the room, but also various other experts from different perspectives and different backgrounds, and that really helped us to develop this policy guidance. And then we published it in January of this year. And then, of course, the 24th of February came, and we saw a full-scale invasion for the first time in a very long time, also in the OSCE region. Then also at the same time, I think while we are all very excited to have you physically here in Vienna, we cannot deny that we still are living to a certain degree in the reality of a health crisis and have been for the last years, more than 2 years, but now really faced a major health crisis. And then we see in parallel how climate and natural disasters are increasing. So there are really a lot of different angles that kind of point to the very unfortunate truth that we are in a crisis-driven kind of crisis shaken world. So this is why we really thought it's necessary to take the general guidance that we developed and to not reassess, but to really try to identify what does it mean in the context of crisis. If we speak about the key principles and key kind of recommendations about what states should be ensuring in the online information spaces around transparency and accountability and inclusive processes, oversight, all of these principles are, of course, valid at all times. They might be becoming even more relevant in times of crisis because society's right to know and need to be informed is even more important or ever more important. But at the same time, we also have to further dig deeper and assess what it means for access to information, but also accessibility, the administration flow of information. Because at the end, especially here at the OSCE, of course, we want to contribute to an informational ecosystem and content governance that's also technology driven, but in the end, conducive to our digital rights, because this will ultimately help peace and comprehensive security, how we call it in the OSCE, democratic processes and also sustainable development. For all these reasons, we held 2 months ago a workshop that really looked at content governance in the times of crisis. And I'm very excited that we have the rapporteur of that workshop with us here today, who is Matthias Kettemann, to the very left of your side, to the right from my perspective. He's professor for innovation and law at the University of Innsbruck. And I would like to start this panel with you. We have in the workshop identified kind of like 5 main points that need to be considered when we are discussing content governance in times of crisis, be it COVID, be it climate, be it conflict, of course. So these 5 points will also a little bit structure the discussion of us today, but maybe you can set us off with the perspective of states and the positive human rights obligations that states have. One of the key points, and this will be kind of the link with which I would like to give you the floor, is that in a workshop we identified that while crises are of course different, and we always have to look at the specific context and the specific kind of like setting that is on the ground, there are also some similarities. And there are short, medium, and long-term crises and crisis effects. So what does it mean for states? What does it mean when we look at the positive human rights obligations to protect and fulfill our human rights, but also freedom of expression in the online space? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julia, for having me. So first of all, let's keep in mind that crisis should not make us scared and stop thinking of how to overcome them. Crisis comes from a Greek word that means to separate. We separate the old from the new. We separate the moment before crisis with the action to overcome this crisis. And as Julia has said, indeed, different kinds of crises demand different kinds of measures. There are short-term crises, medium-term crises, and long-term crises. And throughout this session, we're going to identify different approaches that states and non-state actors have to follow to overcome them with regard to the use of AI in content moderation. So first of all, what about states' obligations regarding human rights in crisis situations, especially with regard to content online? States have an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill their human rights obligations in all circumstances, including the right to freedom of opinion and expression offline, just as online, but here we focus especially on the digital world. It is their task, therefore, proactively to enact effective sets of rules that make it possible to bind platforms to human rights in all kinds of crisis situations. How can they do that? Well, they might have to, for instance, provide for systemic risk evaluations of platforms. My colleague will talk a bit about that. They might require platforms to have measures in place to mitigate those risks. They provide a legal, they have to provide a legal framework which must take care to differentiate between the different kinds of crises that might occur. Short-term crises, for instance, might demand quick measures to fight against illegal content, like terrorism content. Within minutes of the Christchurch massacre, platforms had started to take down the live stream. Do states have the necessary legal framework to force platforms to do that? If they don't, this is something participating states might have to work on. In medium-term crisis, the focus shifts away from quick measures, where sometimes proportionality tests might be less strict, to more sustainable proportionality tests, where freedom of expression should not ex ante be considered less important than the risks that that expression might entail. Platforms therefore have to prepare for crisis situations. They have to develop a media structure through law as part of their constitutional duties that allows democratic discourse to persevere in crisis situations, to persevere against, for instance, disinformation that can be connected to long-term crises, such as climate change, or medium-term crises like the corona situation. Participating states, we argued during the conference, should also not attempt to criminalize crisis-related information exchanges unless unless those restrictions are legal, legitimate, proportionate, and the necessity criteria are met. In any crisis situations, states have to ensure that derogations from human rights are, if at all used, a high exception and only very time limited, the example of fighting Corona has shown that apart from very few exceptions, states have managed without derogations from the European Convention on Human Rights to fulfill their human rights obligations. The regulatory framework which states provide also has to ensure the highest level of transparency possible with regards to how companies act with regards to online content, especially crisis-related content. States should not regulate content too much, but rather should regulate platforms in how they deal with content. Platforms have a certain leeway to provide a private order in which to develop their own priorities, their own rules within the limits that state law and public values set. And those public values include effective crisis management, effective crisis governance. It is also important to ensure that individual bad actors, including accounts profiting from crisis-related information or trying to spread messages of hate or disinformation on the basis of crisis-related information, can be quickly shut down and can be shut down in a way that does not violate neither the terms of service nor the human rights standards that platforms that states have to respect, protect, and implement. Here, national courts can serve an important role to ensure that platforms do not act arbitrarily. We see currently, with regard to a specific network that has recently changed ownership, what happens when rules are no longer respected. We therefore call upon both states and platforms to ensure that, especially in crisis situations, rights and rules are respected, transparency is ensured, and accountability of any measures that impacts our rights and the duties we have as citizens is being respected. The goal of any normative approach to how platforms are regulated, to how states implement their duty to respect, protect, and enable human rights, any approach has to be oriented towards as open, as democratic, as critical and inclusive a discourse as possible. We should not overregulate, but we should take care to learn the lessons from the last 10, 15, 20 years of not providing the necessary rules to include to ensure that public values are ensured even and especially in crisis situations. One approach is, I've mentioned that briefly, to ensure risk assessments and due diligence safeguards, and that's something my colleague will now focus on.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for this really comprehensive overview of the discussions we had, but also really kind of like pinpointing down the obligations that states have, and also underlining that any regulatory measure needs to be put into the broader framework of international human rights. So I think this is really one of the key points. And the second key point I'm taking from your intervention is that proportionality is really context dependent. I think this is also something that was underlined several times throughout the morning, and that there is a need to focus on reach, not speech. So the question of processes and not the content itself. I'm gonna pick up on you already kind of like laid the ground for the next speaker, for Marva, who is MENA Policy Manager at Access Now. And I wanna ask you to indeed speak a little bit about this due diligence safeguards and the risk assessment, but also on one of the aspects that Matthias mentioned, the need to prepare ahead of crisis, because in the end, of course, the aim of all these safeguards is to prevent crisis from unfolding. So Access Now has just launched a declaration on precisely the issue of content and platform governance that was also already mentioned in the morning, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on it.
Thank you, Julia. So perhaps before I jump into the question, perhaps I can give a bit of a quick overview of the current state of affairs and why we launched the Declaration on Content Governance in Times of Crisis. I work in the Middle East and North Africa region, which at least 6 countries in the region are currently marred in conflict and civil wars. And I work in content governance, so I'm in touch with communities on the ground, with activists, human rights defenders, and journalists. And the current state of affairs is often when a crisis hits or a conflict hits, companies try to make up war rooms in an ad hoc manner. We find that they take certain decisions without any transparency, without consultation with affected groups and with civil society and human rights experts who understand the local context and can inform that platform whether indeed the measures, the extraordinary measures that they're planning to take or they're ready to make any sense or have any counterproductive impact on people's rights. The war in Ukraine also happened, and we've seen platforms react completely differently, where they rolled out very swiftly specific types of measures that in other situations of armed conflict, many civil society organizations have been demanding, which raised again the issue about inconsistency. So to sum it up, perhaps we have now platforms approach situations of armed conflict and times of crisis in a very arbitrary, non-transparent and inconsistent matter. And when we talk about laying out the way of how platforms can respond to these extraordinary times in a right-respecting way, human rights due diligence are key. It is extremely important before, for example, a company decides to allow the death of Putin or allow for specific types of groups to be blacklisted or whitelisted, and what type of content should be banned on the platform or further amplified. They need to make sure that they conduct proper conflict-sensitive human rights due diligence throughout the life cycle of the conflict. You've mentioned the need to prepare, and this is key in the declaration. You know, we looked at platform responsibility before, during, and after crises. And it's imperative that the human rights due diligence starts even before. So, for example, companies should look at what are the high-risk areas where we might need to allocate more resources, maybe hire more content moderators, or test our AI systems or our recommender systems to see if a crisis hits indeed or a conflict breaks out. Are we ready? Are our systems ready to be able to respond efficiently and in a right-respecting way? There's also the question of compliance and how companies can or should uphold their responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which lays out in very clear terms that human rights due diligence is a necessity at all times. But when when businesses operate in conflict-affected areas, they have to take an extra care in order not to be legally complicit in gross human rights violations, which means, again, they have to do human rights due diligence that is conflict sensitive, looking at what are the risks, how can we mitigate them, and how effective these mitigation measures are. And this leads me to the points on, again, doing human rights impact assessments and some types of audits after a crisis kind of winded down or subdued, to really understand whether the measures have been effective or not. Because we are operating, as all of us know in this room, in a sort of a information blackout. It really is difficult to understand whether recommender systems actually work, whether the AI systems actually work, what are the error rates, what are the accuracy rates, and what does that mean in practical, real life terms? It means from anecdotal evidence and working with communities on the ground, over enforcement of policies related to terrorism and incitement to violence, because platforms feel we have to over moderate, otherwise we might have governments knocking on our door. And at the same time, disinformation, hate speech, unfortunately remains under moderated. So in one example, for instance, very recently, we pushed Meta to look into how they moderated content in Israel-Palestine. And when the human rights due diligence came out, the results were very damning. it was clear that most, if not all of the measures Meta had violated people's rights to freedom of expression, to access to information, to bodily security, to political participation, non-discrimination. There were high rates of over-enforcement, high rates of under-enforcement when it comes to hate speech. And they were also, they found evidence of bias. That platforms do not handle users and countries in an equitable manner. And when we talk about equity, we're also talking on a global scale. We're also talking about how platforms prioritize certain markets over the other. And the answer to addressing all of these structural problems in a way is human rights due diligence.
Thank you so much. Again, so many important points here. I think one point I wanted to make, I think that the declaration shows really well this kind of like before, during, and post-crisis is something that resonates very well also with the OSCE, where we always speak about the full conflict cycle.
Yeah.
And we also say that kind of like a post-conflict situation that is not well addressed can just lead up to rising tensions again. So it's very important to really address this entire crisis. And I think cycle, and it's very interesting also now that just yesterday, actually, there was a lawsuit against Meta in the Ethiopian conflict scenario for precisely an under and over moderation. So this is a point that I find very interesting. You pointed out now, both kind of like an over compliance with taking down too much, over blocking, but at the same time also not addressing incitement to violence is almost equally damaging and can both contribute to tensions and to conflict. The second point you mentioned that I found incredibly relevant is really to underlining the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Thanks for that. And then leading to already our next speaker, Marlene, to my left, who is now with senior legal consultant at ECNL, but also previously worked at Twitter. So you will really be able to kind of like bring those two perspectives into the conversation. What we just heard from Marva is basically what platforms get wrong, right? I mean, we heard about ad hoc and intransparent and lack of local context and all the things that are super problematic when we speak about content governance in the context of crisis. From your experience from civil society, but also the industry lens, can you maybe react to this criticism, but also link it to the session that you hosted just before, which was focusing on meaningful engagement? And I see that some of the people who also joined that workshop are also here in the room. But I think it would be very useful for everybody to really kind of like follow up on that, how to ensure that throughout this cycle and throughout this entire crisis cycle, but also content governance cycle, those who have the local expertise, those who are really on the ground, civil society, but also academics who have looked into situation can be involved throughout the process to ensure that the risks are duly and properly assessed and also mitigated.
Sure, thanks so much, Julia, and hi, everyone. So as Julia said, I was at Twitter until 2 months ago. And for those who know me, I've been very critical of companies both outside and inside them. So when I joined Twitter, it was against the backdrop of Afghanistan in the past 12 months, Ethiopia, attacks in Sheikh Jarrah in May 2021, and many other conflicts that have been ongoing during that time. So I was overseeing content governance, the legal side, very much focusing on issues outside Europe and the US. And then lo and behold, February 24th, Putin invades Ukraine. And so the conversation has shifted a little bit there. One thing, so a couple of points that I'd like to highlight responding to Julia's question is, and following up directly to what Manuel said, the conflict and crisis issue goes beyond the ones that platforms choose to focus on. So I think it's been clear worldwide that platforms focus a lot on Ukraine. Not to say that that focus was not good or adequate. It was just inconsistent in a way that we have not seen that same attention given to other conflicts. And looking at crisis, which is the topic of this session, I think collectively here, it's important to see how we define crisis to begin with. So in Twitter's case, Twitter defined this as situations of armed conflict, which includes Ukraine, but also public health emergencies, large-scale natural disasters. And to give a little bit, to zoom out a little bit more, in addition to the conflicts that I mentioned before, 2021 was also, and still is, a global pandemic, we are in a climate crisis. Things will probably get worse. So when thinking about platforms and resilience and how to engage with stakeholders, it's really important to look holistically. And from an OSCE perspective and member states as well, and international law more generally, how we define crisis and where conflict fits within that, I think, is a priority. And having a definition that is both comprehensive enough and is future-proof, that can look into our shifting and really shattering conditions, while at the same time being precise and effective so that platforms or any private sector cannot pretend that this is not relevant enough. Doing all this, one thing that is key is to center historically and institutionally marginalized and vulnerable groups. What does that mean for social media? It's both on the side of demographics and personal characteristics, such as women and gender non-conforming persons, members of the queer community, racialized persons, including migrants and refugees, disabled persons, and those of lower socioeconomic class, because those will consistently be disproportionately impacted in situations at high risk, such as conflict. Relatedly, and that is immediately relevant to our work at ECNL, looking at persons in vulnerable situations such as activists, human rights defenders, journalists, and how social media impacts them both in positive and importantly in negative ways in the context of conflict. So bringing this back a little bit more to Twitter and looking at how a company should respond given very short time. If you bring yourselves back to February 24th, like Marwa said, there are other conflicts, but companies often operate on short-term, quarterly, but in this case, it was daily basis. The priority really was to look at digital safety and security resources for users, make sure that they are prompted on the platform, multiple languages, define what priorities are, looking at the risk level, and again, bringing us back to marginalized and vulnerable groups, and taking context-specific measures. And so one of the learnings from the Ukraine crisis, which I took leading legal at Twitter, was to use this as an opportunity to then have lessons learned and make them context-specific for any other crisis that would happen, to not only copy-paste, but to use what is important and helpful, recognizing the different needs, concerns, priorities, and power dynamics between context and looking at that very locally. So very briefly, because I know I'm short on time, some on the process and governance side, which I think many in this room agree here, are some of the key ways we can regulate going forward, is looking at transparency, which is, and Professor Ketterman brought that up. I think transparency is more important than ever in terms of crisis, where you have very fast shifting measures that are not always governance driven and based. And I should mention that all actions that platforms take in the context of crisis should be in addition to the general Santa Clara principles on transparency and accountability and content moderations that companies should implement, especially the 12 that have endorsed it, including Twitter. Another thing to consider of extraordinary measures is sunset clauses. At ECNL, we work a lot on national security and how that is weaponized in the name of more surveillance and censorship.
Can I briefly interrupt you? Can you explain maybe to the room what sunset clauses mean?
Of course,
because I'm not sure everybody's familiar with it.
So when you have in place a temporary emergency measure, such as, for example, specific enforcement guidance of content policies. Am I speaking your language? Okay. When any exceptional measures that any actor, including private sector, would take in the name of a crisis or a conflict or an exceptional situation should end at some point. Otherwise, we go from emergency response to de facto long-term measure. And Professor Ketterman brought up the difference between long-term and short-term crises. And that is something that we are very strict on at ECNL, is that naming something exceptional, but that happens forever, essentially removes the angle of exceptional. And we can see that in the case of Israel and Palestine pretty clearly. So the challenge for these issues is also, what kind of position in a conflict should platforms take? Are they neutral actors? In theory, yes. In practice, open question. I'll let you all make your decision. But in an issue, for example, Ukraine and Russia, when things happen so quickly and there's generally consensus within the international community, but at the same time, there's still no international criminal court or international criminal justice decision. These are all dynamics that have to be considered very quickly because it's often a life or death situation. So I'll wrap up, but one of the key challenges here is that social media platforms have historically underinvested and under-resourced in regions and languages outside the Western Europe and the US. And this presents severe issues for both human content moderation as well as algorithmic content governance, which is much of what we've spoken these couple of days. So there are really hard questions that platforms have to ask themselves. One, what kind of comfort level are we okay with in terms of false positives or false negatives? And what I mean by that is when you remove content, if you remove content that should not have been removed, you're over-enforcing your policies. That de facto leads to impacting folks' freedom of expression, as well as freedom of association and other related rights. If you under-remove it and you leave problematic or illegal content online, that leads to other things such as hate speech, disinformation. And in an area where things shift very quickly and the potential for harm is elevated, some of these questions shift. Again, transparency here is key. I think platforms have a responsibility to communicate clearly how these decisions are made and where they end up. And open question on profit maximization. There's been some talk about business models here. Advertisement, for example, which many of the platforms are advertisement driven. That is still the case today of Twitter, even though Elon Musk's actions have perhaps impacted that. But should companies reassess their business models in the case of crisis and conflict? Should they look differently at advertisements, perhaps pause them in the case of Ukraine, Russia, but at all the other conflicts and crises as well? If you think about COVID, for example, what about advertisement for vaccines that have, I'm American, so Trump at some point brought up some crazy solution. So advertisement for these kind of things, is that in the name of public health or not? I will end by saying that to be externally transparent requires tracking and documenting things internally, which you would be surprised does not always happen. And so there's a big push in the name of the UNGPs as well to really know, to be able to show. I will stop here, but in Q&A, I hope to speak more about how to make this consistent with international human rights law on a content substance side, and the essential role of stakeholder engagement and everything from content substance to governance, looking at both and engaging with local organizations as well as international, being very clear on what, how we are engaging with them. And I won't repeat everything that has been shared with our session today with Mozilla, but really being more intentional and ongoing engagement is the key to make this work. Openness, and both openness with the people with whom we engage, as well as some kind of external sharing, so that this isn't only behind closed doors and multiple groups can engage in multiple media via either written or oral. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, again, very, very useful and very comprehensive overview. The sunset clauses, I think, is a good example, also linking back to the state obligations that we had in the beginning, where Matthias also rightly pointed that any kind of like derogation in the human rights framework also needs to be time limited. And this is one of the key aspects that are also kind of like need to be responsibly taken into account, both from the state side and from the company side. You also pointed out, I think, 2 points that I want to underline again, to then link to our next speaker, Tatiana with the Digital Security Lab Ukraine, who can bring us a little bit of a more real life example of living through this really at this very moment. One of the points that you said is really the investment and the question of resources that also platforms have to put into content governance generally, globally, and not only focusing on specific markets and crisis situation, which links again very nicely to what you said before about coherent mechanisms and coherent protocols. And this, I think, is a very relevant point that we also heard from the Meta representative this morning, that very often, because of the time sensitivity of all these issues that you pointed out, an ad hoc response is there, but ad hoc would not need to be the response if there are protocols and kind of like processes in place with clear criteria and protocols that everybody needs how to react. So listening to all of this, what you now heard on a more kind of like industry perspective, civil society perspective, the academic situation. Tatiana already briefly introduced you, your legal counsel at the Digital Security Lab, Ukraine. You also co-hosted a session this morning looking specifically on the cooperation between state, civil society, and platforms in the specific context of Ukraine. Can you give us a little bit more insight on that, but also trying to link what we heard before about almost kind of like the lessons learned that maybe from the situation in Ukraine right now and from this cooperation that seems to be working quite well to improve the information system or to decrease hatred and disinformation in the Ukrainian war context. What can we learn from it? What are the lessons learned for platforms and for states, also for other crises? And ideally not only conflicts, but also the broader concept of crisis.
Yeah, actually, I'm very grateful for the opportunity actually to speak about those issues, because they're very outstanding, especially in view of what's happening around the world, not only in Ukraine and not only related to armed conflicts. As regards our personal experience related to the war itself, I suppose that, and here I absolutely agree with what Marlena said, that different types of crises have to be treated differently. There can be no crisis protocol which is adaptable to any type of crisis. For example, pandemics, pre-election period, which is also sensitive when people also are receptive towards different types of hateful messages and disinformation, and the armed conflicts contexts are absolutely different in their nature, not only from how people behave, but also from the legal perspective, because different types of legal norms apply. And here I find it really important to speak about transparency issue, because as a representative of civil society, apparently I agree that transparency matters. But for example, in the context of armed conflicts, it is also important to preserve confidentiality of some issues. For example, when companies enter into the dialogue with representatives of civil society or representatives of the state, some issues might remain confidential because it might be the state secret, or not in Ukraine, but in other regions. Representatives of civil society might be endangered because the governments are authoritarian and they might repress those individuals. This also has to be taken into account. Therefore, for me, transparency always is firstly about the how can every stakeholder get into the dialogue, rather than what stakeholders can speak about into that dialogue. So sometimes issues might preserve confidential inside that communication, but every single stakeholder has to know on which subjects can the dialogue be built on and how to enter the dialogue. And that's actually what drives me to the point of multi-stakeholder cooperation itself. The platforms themselves, as a focal point of this discussion, they have to clearly notify all stakeholders based on which issues and based on what subjects they're ready to cooperate. For example, they have to clearly state that if there are aggressor states who are trying to suppress speech, the cooperation on such issues will not be developed further than a certain point. For example, the dialogue is started if the states are not ready to change their policies towards freedom of expression, if the states are not ready to build the adequate policies, human rights protective policies, then the dialogue would not proceed. The same regards the Human Rights Protection Index. So the companies shall not cooperate with the states which have a very high rate of violations of human rights, because that would not be effective, but sometimes it might lead to manipulation by the company's behavior from the side of the state, especially since actually, we have to be fair on this point, at this point, that business always depends on income. And sometimes states might manipulate by closure of the market, forcing companies to behave certain way. And that's directly the point where the companies shall refuse to cooperate, because human rights shall be put higher on the list of values than income. But that's also the task which has to be done, which has to be performed, and the consideration has to be done in this respect. Also, I wanted to stress the really important, from my perspective, point about the participation of international organizations, including the United Nations, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and others. Indeed, and that's the point I advanced before, and which was advanced today by Marlena, that companies cannot wait for the decision of the International Court of Justice or the decision of the International Criminal Court or Special Criminal Tribunal, for example, when the issue regards the atrocities, because it might take like 10 years, 20 years for the truth to be established, but it does not mean that policies shall not be changed throughout this period. And that's the point where the companies take risks. But the risks cannot be endless, because again, we go back to the issue of business models. They cannot have endless losses. Therefore, international organizations who have power and who have reputation and whose word has weight has to dwell upon the outstanding issues. For example, whether the incitements in Ukrainian context are incitements to genocide or not. That's what has to be addressed for Meta, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Telegram, and other companies to work effectively. If it is incitement to genocide, they will behave one way. If it is purely hate speech, they will behave other way. But who can tell them whether it is incitement or not? That can be done only by international organizations with the reputation and with weight given to their words. It cannot be like local NGO. Unfortunately, we are willing to be in the position, but we are not. As regards civil society, one of the most concerning issues, unfortunately, we were not on time to bring it during our morning session, but that really concerns us a lot. There are umbrella organizations which do wonderful work. They create the platform for a dialogue between the smaller local partners. But umbrella organizations such as Article 19, ECNL, ICNL, Access Now sometimes lack local expertise. And if companies contact only big international civil society organizations, sometimes their expertise cannot help, cannot assist. That's why they have to deal directly with local partners. Another issue with local partners, though, and it's not the context of Ukraine, but it's rather the broader perspective, that local partners can and shall be picked with consideration of diversity. Because sometimes, especially when the crisis concerns, for example, pre-election periods, the local partners can have one or another view, and lots of different voices have to be heard on the ground to build the policy appropriately. Because if it is some kind of the issue which is more or less clear-cut, like saying that atrocities are bad and violate human rights, it will be more or less clear. But in other issues, the broader variety of voices has to be heard. And that's it for now. So I give floor back to Julia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, especially for underlying the need for local expertise and really acknowledging the local context. I found it also incredibly important that you underlined that the human rights responsibilities by platforms are independent of those of the states. So sometimes also, and you mentioned also briefly, the positive impact that platforms can have for human rights and civic engagement in the context of crisis. And at the same time that we kind of have to think about manipulation and misuse of the systems and also have regulatory responses. We have 15 minutes left, so I would like to open the floor now to the audience if there are any questions or comments, but I would then at the end like to still give back the floor to each of our excellent speakers to come up with a kind of like key message you would want to bring to this room or key recommendations. We have also many state representatives here with us. So this is also a kind of like opportunity to underline a key aspect again on this topic. But before that, Are there any questions, comments, additional points by anyone in the audience? If not, that's also perfectly fine. Then we can start with the round of recommendations and maybe also building on this. I mean, I can also continue with several questions from my side, but in the sake of time, I think it's fairer to give the floor back to you. Maybe we do it in the same direction and you can point out a key message, key recommendations, and then maybe at the end, we still have time for a follow-up question, should there be any from the people in the room. Matthias, can I start with you again, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julia. So one key point that I'd like to make is that the crisis situations we have experienced in the past years, have shown us how effectively control over information flows and control over communication infrastructure can be weaponized, can be used to pursue certain means, certain goals, which are in contradiction to public values, to rule of law, to democracy, to fundamental rights. The actors that leverage their access to the control infrastructure regarding information and communication flows range from terrorists, providers of terrorism, pro-terrorism content, to disinformation agents, state-sponsored or independent, with economic goals or those with political goals to destabilize societies, using existing crises, and enmeshing actual stories with disinformation. Platforms are not innocent in that. They have profited in the past from disinformation and have only more recently started to be more active, proactive now to stand up against crisis-related disinformation. Let's not forget, for instance, that vaccine-related disinformation was not prohibited on platforms until the emergence of the corona crisis. We should also not forget that the key one key element we've identified during the workshop and also at this session is that a rules-based approach to dealing with crisis information is essential. And if we now combine those two aspects, namely that those who are in control of those actors that control information and communication infrastructure can have a powerful impact on the way that communication flows are used in crisis, and at the same time that those actions have to be rule-based, rule of law based, we already see a key pressure point that participating states can exercise, namely participating states have to ensure, in pursuance of their obligation to respect, protect, and implement human rights, that all actors here, especially platforms that control substantial parts of the communication and information infrastructure we use in our digital age, that they, in dealing with crisis-related information flows, communication during, on, about, within crisis, they set clear rules, that they prime their algorithms, optimize their algorithms, not primarily on engagement, on profiteering from crisis situations, but rather on the public values that allow us to overcome crisis, that may include public values like social cohesion, fundamental rights, plurality of opinion, media freedom, freedom of expression. We're entering a new age of responsibilization of online actors, and states have an important role to play here in pushing this process forward. And they can do that, they have to do that by using all the tools, all the legal tools within the framework of their rule of law obligations at their disposal. Thank you.
Many thanks. Marva?
Thank you, Julia. So going back to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which outline not only private companies' responsibility to identify human rights risks and ways to mitigate them, and as well as providing remedies when such violations or negative harms occur, but they also outline responsibilities of states. And in situations of crisis or conflict, states have a responsibility to support businesses to avoid violating human rights in conflict-affected areas. And given the cross-border nature of some crises, like the global pandemic, for instance, and the global nature of the platforms themselves, the countries that host these platforms have also responsibility to ensure that the companies uphold their responsibilities, especially during times of crises. And in our declaration on content governance in times of crises, we outline how these responsibilities, and more specifically of how the human rights due diligence should look like, and what are the points or the issues that platforms should look into. And maybe when we think about regulation and the possibility of baking in human rights due diligence and audits and human rights impact assessments as legally mandated by platforms, as opposed to the current situation where it's based on the goodwill and the sufficient resources or lack thereof available to platforms. And so when we discuss human rights due diligence or impact assessments before a crisis, it's essential for platforms to look at any foreseeable negative impacts, not only on human rights, but also on companies' obligations under international humanitarian law. As Tatiana mentioned, in times of crisis, different legal standards apply. They should also look into any negative impacts that could happen in situations of elections, on public discourse, as well as on whether, for instance, companies have in-country staff, including content reviewers hired by third parties in specific countries. For example, when Meta took certain decisions in the context of Ukraine, it endangered their staff that were present in Russia. So it's important also before a crisis that platforms look at where they exist, where their resources are, and how this might be impacted in the future, and particularly in high-risk areas. And then one thing important when we think for states and how they include human rights due diligence and audits in their regulatory frameworks, that any of those human rights due diligence or audits should be made transparent and done by independent parties, and this is important to avoid the box ticking exercise that also happens currently by companies. I see your hand on the button, so maybe just to wrap up from my end, another important recommendation for states here is looking at how they cooperate with platforms, especially when there's an absence of a regulatory framework, whereby governments submit certain requests for companies for content removal or account suspension. These take sometimes long times if you go through proper judicial processes, and in times of crises, then governments want companies to take swift action. And here we have certain protocols that have been established throughout the last few years, through internet referral units, where governments escalate cases to platforms to remove content, suspend accounts based on their own terms of services, which privatizes law enforcement on the one hand, and results sometimes in decisions that negatively impact human rights. And here, in the absence of transparency, where platforms until this point, none of their transparency reports publish any data on government requests. So for example, we don't know if the Russian government is asking Meta or Twitter or any of the companies to take down specific Ukraine-related content. Mandating that platforms publish data on these requests and the types of requests, as well as the compliance, is very key to tackle this issue moving forward.
Very important point. Many thanks for raising that as well. Marlena, please.
Thanks. Yes, very briefly, and building on Marwa's statements, I'd say one of the key priorities from our perspective, ECNL, is focusing on human rights impact assessments within broader human rights due diligence. And we've been doing that at the European and international level, from EU, DSA, EUAI Act and upcoming corporate sustainability due diligence directive, but also this came out very clearly in the declaration that Mara presented today. And so from a platform perspective, in the context of crisis specifically, it's especially important to publish at the very least a summary of the findings of this impact assessment. And this also coming back to whether the conflict is long-term or short-term, should really have a mix of preliminary risk assessments that have to be done very quickly when we see troops are coming or a pandemic is escalating within days. Full-blown a full comprehensive human rights impact assessment can take months to a year. And like Tatiana brought in the time critical situation, there are multiple measures that companies can take, and the way that governments would regulate impact assessments is really important here. In any case, it's important to have ongoing internal staff to monitor also in an ongoing way what levels of risk are within which conflict and not context. You mentioned elections, pandemics, conflicts. There are many areas in the company where I worked at until 2 months ago. For example, most of those people are gone today. So understanding who is hired for what position within platform and how much internal decision-making power they have is really important as well. So when governments think about that, it's not enough to have a performative fancy title, but how much power do you actually have to make these things happen? And then the other side of the coin of that is how do you collaborate externally with stakeholders? And we talked a lot today about the need for really going locally, communicating with folks who have local expertise in terms of the dynamics, the communities at risk, and the language, of course, which is often forgotten. One thing that I would like to highlight that Mara brought up on the first pillar of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights essentially reiterates government's responsibility, not even responsibility, sorry, obligation to respect human rights. So international human rights law and humanitarian law is binding for member states. And I think we often forget that. So when we focus so much on platforms, we sometimes forget the fact that governments regulate platforms, but they're also users themselves. So in areas and in situations of crisis, governments can do a lot of harm, and they must, by law, respect international law. And I will close by saying that the obligation of platforms for publishing their policies also extends to, or should extend to, publishing enforcement guidelines, at least at a high level. On a high level. So if you go to transparency centers and the community guidelines of each platforms, you will see how they define terrorist content, how they define misinformation. Twitter now no longer has a COVID misinfo policy that Matthias mentioned as of 2 weeks ago. At least Elon Musk made that public. But all this to say that the way these policies are enforced, there's almost an entire book and dictionary that goes behind how these policies are enforced, and none of that is generally public. So I will pause there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tatiana. Final recommendation from your side.
It's actually very difficult to speak the last one, but my main recommendation probably would be for all of the stakeholders to be proactive, not reactive. And here is the funny story. Actually was organizing the morning panel, because one day before the panel, when sending the link to the document with preparations, I occasionally send the link to Timothy Snyder lectures on emergence of Ukraine as an independent state. And that's actually very interesting piece of information for everyone to learn, and especially for those who are dealing with crisis situations. Why? Because any company or any international organization on human rights or any international intergovernmental organization, before entering certain crisis situation, has to learn its history. And for companies who operate in the regions, the history of those regions shall be learned even if there is no crisis yet, and even if no crisis is expected. And that's very important. Only this way all the problems which have been identified throughout the whole day, like all the panels which took place today, can be meaningfully addressed. Matthias today mentioned the weaponization of information issue. And basically, there is also issue of lawfare when legal concepts are manipulated, as Russia now does with the concept of right to protect or responsibility to protect invading Ukraine. But such manipulations would not be perceived if all the actors who are dealing with those issues from legal perspective, from policy perspective, from social perspective, would really know the history of Ukraine, the socio-political context, the geopolitical context of the region itself. So from my point of view, it's really important to get to be aware with what issues are you really dealing in practice, and only then start in proposing recommendations.
Many thanks for this. We are out of, Antonina, very, very briefly, because we are out of time already with the next session.
Then just seriously, 2 seconds. And this is just to maybe add to Tatiana's point. I think generally we need to focus more on prevention, because what we are discussing is essentially reactive, while both, ICC, PR and Genocide Convention are talking about prevention. And actually you may not have genocide proven, but you can still have incitement to genocide perfectly proven. It's a separate crime. And coming to your point about, for instance, Facebook personal in Russia, I mean, everything that happened was seen long before. Russia has prepared legal grounds for everything for the last several years, and companies, if they were actually also following this situation, they didn't want to react. That's the story. If they reacted, they would have never had any situation of endangering personnel or whatever, because first package of laws adopted end of 2020 and second package of laws adopted mid of 2021. So it was all clear, but we never actually paid enough attention to prevention.
Many thanks for underlying this. I think that's really one of the key points we take from this session. I don't want to pretend to repeat or kind of sum up everything, but I think it's still maybe to underline a few points that I think were the key messages of this panel. First, also linking to what Antonina, my colleague, just said now, the need for prevention and for proactive responses that need to be consistent, that need to be transparent and based on independent contributions. The second point is that we need to ensure specific considerations for marginalized voices or for vulnerability and vulnerable situations. The third point, which was really kind of a thread throughout the discussions, where that content governance needs to be rooted in human rights and in local context. This means it needs to be rules-based, rule of law-based. We heard there were some catchy kind of phrases like the need to know, to be able to show, regulating reach, not speech, and then also the need for meaningful engagement throughout the entire processes. I think all of this really links to the question of how we as individuals and societies are able to access and deal with information so that we can have a vibrant and pluralistic information space. This, I think, links perfectly to the next panel that will start in 1 minute. We just need to briefly rearrange, that really talks about the access and exposure of public interest information and content. So please stay seated. I want to thank once again the excellent contributions and the panelists here on this panel. And now we will rearrange for the next panel that will start in only a minute. Thank you.